Today we're talking about Chapter 28, the modern JavaScript landscape. Up until now, you have learned all of the JavaScript basics of for loops and all the syntax that has been around for a really long time. New syntax was introduced about 9 or 10 years ago that gives us some very efficient ways to handle everyday code. And there are programmers out there professionally using this all the time. So we want to introduce this just in time to talk about React, because React does rely heavily on a lot of the more modern syntax. I'm going to cover some things here that are in Chapter 28. I'm also going to go ahead and introduce some other things you're going to need for React and just talk about them today so that we can just focus on React when we do those lectures separately. So I'll start with talking about the difference between like what does it mean to say vanilla JS, what is ES6, some of this terminology. Then I'll talk about the ternary operator, the spread operator, the concept of destructuring with both arrays and objects. We'll look at the for of loop, a whole new type of for loop you haven't learned yet, and then arrow functions. Then I'll cover modern import-export syntax, which is important for working with modules in modern JavaScript. And I'll talk about JavaScript extension, creating something like JSX from JavaScript, and TypeScript, a superset of JavaScript, and this idea of transpiling things to JavaScript to be able to be run as regular JavaScript. So what is vanilla JavaScript? This is just a generic term. It's not an actual library or anything. It just refers to JavaScript that's used without adding libraries or frameworks. For example, React is a library, Angular is a framework. So if you're just using JavaScript without any additional framework around it, that's vanilla JS. ECMAScript, or ES6 for short, introduced really major updates to JavaScript in 2015. And you're already using some of that syntax when you use things like let and const, and the fact that there are JavaScript classes, which did not used to exist. But there's quite a lot of things, and you can learn more about it at W3 Schools here. I've got a link that will kind of guide you through exactly what those changes were. And then libraries like React are going to use this modern JavaScript, as I mentioned. So we're going to learn a lot of this today and just get you prepared for using React when we do that in the next lecture. Let's start with a ternary operator. This allows you to do if-else logic in a single line. So you use two operators in combination with one another, a question mark and a colon, and it goes like this. First, you have a condition, and then you ask the question, is that true or false? And if it's true, you set the value here. Otherwise, you set the value that goes after the colon. So in this example, I've got a variable that I have declared. I just have not initialized it. And then I decide, okay, I want to set one value or another, so I can do that. In the traditional syntax, I would have just done it like this with if is loading and then done this, else, this. But I can write this entire thing just like this by declaring the variable and then having this ternary expression. This entire thing is the ternary expression. To evaluate and resolve to either this value or this value, and then store that in this variable page text. Let's take a look at an example. So we have an example up here in the top. Let's start with a couple of things that already exist here. We have Pike in chair, and that's true. So Captain Pike is in his chair. And if this were to be false, we would say otherwise Spock is in command as his second in command. And so I'm going to come up with a phrase. And if I use this traditional syntax, I have to do it like this. I declare it, and then I run my logic and say, if Pike is in the chair, the phrase will be hit it. Otherwise, the phrase will be, if Spock is in command, I would like the ship to go now. And we can write an equivalent expression for this that actually will use the ternary and be very concise. So let's just call it phrase 2 so that we can still have our original phrase existing up there. I'll say let phrase 2, and then all in one line say Pike in chair, question mark. Then let's set the value, hit it if that's true. Otherwise, let's set the value. I would like the ship to go now. There we go. And let's print that. Okay. So I will node chapter 28 / modern JavaScript examples.js. There we go. Okay, and we get hit it because Pike in chair is true. And if we change this to false and we run it again, we get I would like the ship to go now. So there you have it. If else logic in a single line. All right, let me change this back. Okay, let's do the next one. The spread operator. This is this idea of being able to pull elements out of an array. It can be used with an array or an object. I'll show you that too. So for an array, you would just take all of the elements out of the array by putting the spread operator in front of the name. And that'll simplify things. There's a lot of different uses for this. One would be making a copy of an array that isn't just an alias that points to the original array in memory. You could combine arrays this way instead of concatenating them. You can provide arguments for math.min and math.max, which expects a sequence of numbers, but not inside the array. So here's a couple of examples. I have let array 1 equal, the numbers 1, 2, and 3. Array 2 is array 1. On the other hand, I could say let array 3 and take array 1 and spread all of them and extract those things and put them in a new array by creating new brackets here. So if I go and I check the equality of 1 and 2, that's going to come back as true because array 2 is just an alias for array 1. But if I check equality with array 1 and array 3, it's false because I really did create a whole new array here in memory and established it with some new brackets and then just pulled out the 1, the 2, and the 3 from array 1 and placed them in here. That's what the spread operator does. Here's an example where we create array 4 and we say, I want to start with the 3 elements from array 1, and then I also want to add 4, 5, and 6. And now if I console log array 4, I see a single array with all of these elements side by side, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So again, the spread operator here just pulled them out, the 1, the 2, and the 3, and let them, be right in front of this. And then math.max, I could give it, array 4 here, which we now know has the 6 numbers, and just use the spread operator to extract those numbers and give it to math.max, and of course that resolves to 6. So let's do an example of using the spread operator. I have 3 crews. Crew 1, they're all part of the same crew, but I have 3 different arrays of crew members. Is maybe a better way to say this. Captain Pike number 1 and Spock are in one array. Uhura, Laan, Ortegas, Hemmer, and Kyle are in the second one, and Dr. Mbenga and Nurse Chapel are in the third one. We would like to use the spread operator to combine all of the members of the enterprise into a single array. So I will create a new one and say, let enterprise crew equal, and then I'll create a new array. And then to extract the elements out and place them in here so they're all side by side, I'll just say spread operator crew 1, comma, spread operator crew 2, comma, and spread operator crew 3. All right, now let's print it. And we should see a single array with all of them. And there it is. Let me pull this up. Good. So you can see that we have all 10 crew members in the same array now. Okay. Okay, so for destructuring, first I want to talk about destructuring in terms of arrays. So just in general, it's the idea that you can create multiple variables from the contents of an object or an array. And then each element of an array would, have its own variable name to represent that value. So for an array, we're going to use the keyword let or const. On the right side of the assignment operator, we're going to name the array holding the elements. And on the left side, we'll assign variable names inside brackets to create those and make sure they correspond to each of the elements in the original array. So let's break this down. Let's say we had a username. Bob and Jones are the two elements in this array, right? Index 0, index 1. So you could, go the way that you already know how to. You could create variables, let first name and let last name, and just assign username at index 0 and username at index 1 in order to capture those specific elements and put them in these variables. But there's a better way. Instead, you can use the keyword let and refer to the array on the right side here, on the right side of the assignment operator, and then inside these brackets, create new variables that are going to correspond to the values in the array. So Bob will be stored in first name, Jones will be stored in last name. And then when you say hello first name, that's going to read out hello Bob. Let's do an example. So we have these existing arrays up here. We're going to keep using these. So let's look at crew 3. We have Dr. Mbenga and Nurse Chapel. Let's say we want to create the variables doctor and nurse and capture those values out of that array. I can say let doctor, comma, nurse equal crew 3. That's all I have to do. And now doctor has the value of Dr. Mbenga and nurse has the value of Nurse Chapel. Let's log each of them. And there we go, Dr. Mbenga and Nurse Chapel. So those were properly stored from the values that were here up here in this array. Okay, let's do one more little thing here that I did not mention on the slide is that you can actually skip over elements if you use an extra comma. So let's look at the first one. We've got crew 1 that is Captain Pike, number 1, and Spock. Let's say we really only need to capture the first one and the last one. We could create variables, captain and science officer. I can say let captain, comma, and then since I don't really want anything for number 1 here, let's say this is the episode where she's in prison. I'll just say comma again, and then science officer. So that's how I skip over an element. And then I just say, let's take the elements from crew 1 and assign them to these variables. Now I can console log captain and console log science officer. And we get Captain Pike and Spock. Okay. What about objects? We can do the same thing with objects by assigning variable names to object properties. So again, you'll use the keyword let or const, and then on the right side, name the object that's holding the key value pairs. On the left side, you'll use curly braces to represent the object and then put the names of the variables inside that to correspond to the key names. Now, the key names either can be the original key names, in which case you just refer to them directly, or you can use a colon to set a new name if you would like. So let's look at an example of this. I have an object, user address. It's got a street address, a city, a state, and a zip code, 4 different keys, right? Let's say that I want to extract the city and state from this for some reason. I can go ahead and do that. I can create city and state with the const keyword here and just assign user address to be the object that these are pulled out from. And because there are city and state keys, it knows to grab New York and NY, right? For this one, let's say I want to extract zip code, but I don't want to call it zip code. I'd actually prefer to call it zip. I can do it like this. I can say, go find zip code, but let's call it zip and extract it from user address. And now I can console log these. If I console log city, I get New York. If I console log zip, I get 55555. All right, let's do an example of this. We have an object, let enterprise equal, and we have three keys, ship name, registry number, and class. So I'm just going to create ship name and registry. I'm not going to worry about the class. And because these are not stored sequentially like an array, you don't have to do anything special to skip over another key. You just don't include it. So it'll be as simple as just saying const ship name, and then let's give registry number a new name. We'll say registry. So I'll say registry number, but let's call it registry. And we'll set that equal to the object enterprise. And so it should pull those out. So now we can test it. Console log ship name, console log registry. Notice how VS Code is helping you out to remember that this is actually the original property name from here, and this is the new variable that you're creating, just like ship name. And you can tell by the color, the way it's done this, because to me, this is a little bit counterintuitive to do these two backwards to put the alias, second, but this is how it's done. So just remember that the first one is the original, and the second one is the new variable you're creating that will now be in scope to represent that value that's stored in here, the NCC 1701. So we'll pull that up, and there we go, enterprise and NCC 1701. Our next topic, I had more things on my slide, look at that. Okay. So this is a loop that has the keywords for and of that allows you to iterate through an array from start to finish. Every single element will be accessed from the beginning to the end, one at a time, but you don't need to use any sort of index. You just use the let keyword and create this block scope variable here. And there's no bracket notation since you're not using an index. So the keywords are for, let, and of. And then you are saying, I want to go through this array here, right? So you say, I'm creating a variable here that will represent one element at a time from that array. And then that's the one you use each time. And so we could console log each one and loop through it. And we would see in the console red, blue, and green. So we'll do a basic example of this with just a simple array. You remember up here we have crew 2, right, with 5 different members of the crew. Let's go through that and iterate over it and just print each name. So I'll just say for let member, and this can be anything I want. So I'll just call it member of crew 2. And we'll just console log member. And we should see those names one at a time. All right, good. We have all 5 of them, Uhura, Laan, Ortegas, Hemmer, and Kyle. All right. Another thing that this for of loop is useful for is iterating over a map object. Now, this is a special class in JavaScript that allows you to hold key value pairs as a set without it actually being an object. And it's also not exactly an array of arrays either. It's a special type of object. So when you create this object that has those pairs in it, it gives you the flexibility of having keys that are not just strings. They can be anything. So you could have keys be actually, the number 1, 2, 3, etc. And it is ordered. So those key value pairs will always be in the same order. And then you can use the for of loop along with destructuring to access both the key and the value at the same time as you're looping through. So it looks a little bit like this. First, you have an array of arrays that you're going to create your data from. And then we create the map. We say, let's create an alpha map. We'll create a new map object and give it this array of arrays, and it will transform it into a map that has these key value pairs, where the keys are actually numbers, not strings, and the values are A, B, and C. And then it's going to stay in this order. It will always be in the same order that it was in the array. So if we wanted to iterate through this, we could iterate through alpha map. Now, keep in mind, we're not iterating through alpha, we're iterating through alpha map. But we could use destructuring to create two different variables here to represent the key and the value. So we'll call it number and letter to make it really clear which one we're talking about. So I could say let number and letter of alpha map, and then go through and say letter, whatever number it is the letter. And so then we see printing out letter 1 is A, letter 2 is B, letter 3 is C. And this gave us the flexibility of having access to both of those all at once. This is going to be something that is helpful from time to time in React. So let's do an example of this. Let's say we have the founders of the Federation, United Earth, Confederacy of Vulcan, Andorian Empire, United Planets of Tellar, and then Alpha Centauri Concordium. And they are numbered. Every key that we are going to create in this map is going to be a number. So we create a map, Fed Founders map, and pass in this array of arrays, and it creates those key value pairs. So now let's print the map so we can see everything used together. Let's print it first. Print it first, and then we'll do the loop. Okay, so this is interesting. You've not seen something printed out this way before, right? It shows you it's a map. That's the class of object that this is. And it shows you that the value for 1 is United Earth, the value for 2 is Confederacy of Vulcan, etc. So we're not dealing with a JavaScript object, and we're also not dealing with an array. We're dealing with a map, which is totally different. So let's do our loop. I'll say let, and then extract num and member of Fed Founders map. And that way we have the keys and the values both available to us with separate variables here. And I'll just log the number with a period and make a nice little list for us here with member. And we see them nicely listed out. 1 is United Earth, 2 is Confederacy of Vulcan, etc. Okay. Yeah, so again, there's the map object. Here are the local variables for those key and values, the keys and the values, where every time we iterate around, they represent a different one. Now let's talk about arrow functions. This is absolutely essential for working with React, and really just coding in JavaScript. If you use JavaScript professionally, you are going to find that you're using arrow functions a lot, especially for anonymous functions. So this is called an arrow operator or a fat arrow operator, and it replaces the function keyword. And you also, instead of putting it first, like the function keyword, you actually put it after the parameters. So typically you would store it in a const to prevent it from being overwritten. And then you need then to declare it above where you intend to use it, because a const has scope issues, right? You have to have it up above wherever it needs to be used. So that is an important distinction. If you need to have a function that is going to be declared below where you're using it, then you'd have to do a traditional one like this. But this, as long as you can just define it above, or maybe you're importing it from another file and it's imported from above, then no problem. You can use it wherever you need to use it. So here's a breakdown. In a traditional function syntax, you have a function keyword. But in the arrow function, you have the fat arrow instead, and that indicates that it's a function. In both cases, you have parameters, In the original one, the name is just put before the parameters. Here, you're using const to have a variable name. And so you'll still call it, with add nums and pass in a number for A and a number for B. But this short form with the fat arrow means exactly the same thing that this does. So let's simplify it further, because this actually can get much more simplified. This is, doesn't really look like it's all that much less code. We really just replaced function with a fat arrow. But we can slim this down a little bit and get rid of some of these things with the newer syntax. So if you want to simplify it, for one thing, if there's only one parameter, you can actually omit the parentheses around the parameter. And if there are no parameters, you do need the parentheses. They'll just be empty. And of course, if there's more than one, same thing. You'll need those parentheses. If there's only one line of code in the function body, you can actually omit the brackets and the return keyword. So let's look at how this could be simplified. We just had our const add nums. We said the parameters were going to be A and B. We use the arrow to indicate that it's a function, and then we have a function body. So if I put it on one line, I can do it the same way it was on the previous slide and just say return A and B, A plus B. But this is actually not necessary. If it's just that one line, I can just streamline it and say add nums takes two parameters, A and B, and it should return A plus B, and boom, that's it. Means exactly the same thing. So let's say we create, and let me click on this. There we go. Yeah, so you can see all of these are parameters, right? A, B, A, B. Here's an example of where we have a single parameter with first name here. And here's an example of where we have no parameter, so we need to put the parentheses in, but we can leave them off when you have first name like this. Okay. And then this is that simplified return where, because of the arrow, you actually don't need to have the return keyword or the braces. Something that's important to understand here about this short form, though, is that if you get rid of the braces, you have to get rid of the return keyword, and vice versa. You can't use one without the other. So either you have both like this, or you have neither like this. All right, let's do a simple example of this. We'll do a couple of examples of taking traditional functions and rewriting them as an arrow function. So we've got a function explore where we pass a planet in, and it says, let's go boldly toward the planet. So we will rewrite this under the name go boldly. So I'll say const go boldly. And then use the assignment operator to assign the function definition. But because I'm using an arrow function, the parameters go first. And I actually only have one parameter, so I don't even need parentheses. I can just say planet and then use my arrow and then say, this is what I want you to do to execute that function. Just console log. Let's go boldly toward planet. That's it. So no return keyword, no brackets. I just did the console log because it was a one-liner. So that's very straightforward. So I can actually call this now, go boldly, and pass in Nibiru. We'll run it. And it says, let's go boldly toward Nibiru. Okay. Let's have another one. We have this function here, make it go. And it takes a speed factor and it has an optional parameter of type. If we leave off the type, it's going to assume that we want an impulse engine. So if it's warp, we want to say warp factor and then whatever the speed factor is. Otherwise, if it's just defaulting to impulse, we can say speed factor impulse and just return that. So let's start by setting up our arrow function to do this. And we're just going to call it hit it, const hit it. And I have two parameters, so I do need to use parentheses. I'll say speed factor and type. and then use my arrow. And I just have a single console log that I want to do. So I don't need the brackets, the curly braces, and I don't need the return keyword. And I'm not even returning anything, right? I'm just console logging, but I don't need the curly braces. And I can console log, and now I can say, I can also simplify this with a ternary expression, right? And say type is type warp, and then we'll say, and then I can just copy the string that's here and say, or it'll be the string that's here. Okay. And then we can call this with both. Let's say hit it is pass in full. And then we'll also call hit it with 8 and warp as the values. Okay, so we see full impulse and warp factor 8. So it printed out exactly what it needed to, depending. So when we had warp, it printed out warp factor and the speed factor, which was 8. And when we passed in just full, it printed full impulse. Now this gets a little bit long, right? And say, what's the point of having this be, really streamlined if it's still hard to read because it's long and it's wrapping around? There's actually ways to get this to format. I'm going to use my prettier formatter to do it quickly, but this would be an acceptable way to format this where it is on multiple lines, but it's still a single line of code, right? It has a single semicolon and it starts with const. So, it just makes it easier to read. So you're going to see things like this out there. I show you these things not to confuse you, but to help you, because learning to read this kind of code is going to be really essential. You're going to have to get used to being able to decipher what's happening when you look at things like this. So the sooner you kind of work through that learning curve of looking at these types of functions and understanding what's happening, the better. So, because you're accustomed to seeing a function keyword instead of this and seeing it up in the front, and you're accustomed to having curly braces around your function body and all that sort of thing. And you're going to have to learn how to read these as well. Okay. One last thing I want to do with arrow functions, and that's to revisit higher order functions, because we often use anonymous functions to pass into higher order functions, and you're almost always going to see them done with arrow functions. So we remember from chapter 11 about the higher order array method map, right? Where you can create a new array from an existing array. So we're going to have a parameter to represent a single element and a body of code to execute as a function definition to pass into map and say, execute this code for every single element in the array. So the result will be a new array of the same length with all of those new values in it. So the example I have here on the slide is that we have an array of 4 numbers. And we say, let squares equal, and we go to nums and map over it and say, for every num, I want you to return num squared. And then for cubes, we do the same thing and say, let's create another array that for every single element, it returns num cubed. So that is a very, very, concise bit of code there, right? In both cases. And what it did was it looped over all of this, and it goes and it runs this little function here for every single one and cubes it, and then sticks that in a new array for you. So when you console log squares, you have 1, 4, 9, and 16 in an array. And when you console log cubes, you'll have 1, 8, 27, and 64 in an array. So again, these are your parameters. You're saying, let's just use this as to represent every single element in the nums array. And then here's the simplified return. Just do this to the num and make that the new element in the new array. Okay. So quick example, we've got planets, Andoria, Vulcan, Earth, Kronos, and Risa. And we're going to make them all capitalized. So we'll just say let cap planets equal, I'll take planets and map over it. And I'll say for every planet, return planet to uppercase. Just like that. Very concise. We just say create a parameter to represent each element. And then in the new array that you're creating with map, just replace, make it planet to uppercase instead. So we can console log at planets. And we see Andoria, Vulcan, Earth, Kronos, and Risa all in uppercase. And just as a reminder, this does not mutate the original array. So if I console log planets, I still see the original planets where they aren't in all caps. Map creates a whole new array, and that's why I stored it in a variable, because I needed somewhere for that return value to go from map. Okay. Our next topic is modern import-export syntax. When you are exporting items from a modern JavaScript module, you're going to use modern syntax to do that. And React absolutely uses it this way. Most frameworks and libraries do. So you're going to use the export keyword in front of each item if you have multiple items. If you only have one item, you can actually use export and default, and you do that at the end of the file. So let's look at examples here. Let's say we have our addnums function here, our little simplified one, and that's the only thing that we're exporting. We can just, down here at the bottom, say export default addnums, and that'll be exported. If we have multiple things in a file, like addnums and subtractnums, then we just put the export keyword in front of the declaration with const in both cases, and they will be exported individually. But they're exported as part of an object. So it's still going to, group them together the same way that it's done with the older syntax in an object. You just don't actually create the object in order to do that. You can just put export on these and let that happen. So there's the keywords, export and default in this case, where we just have the one. So on the import side of this, what do you do once you've exported them like this, right? On the import side, at the very top, you're going to use two keywords in conjunction with one another, import and from. And if something was the default export, you can just refer to it by name directly. So when we had our example of having addnums be the only one, we had export default in front of it, we can import addnums from add.js, no problem. Let's say we've got our math.js file that had multiple exports, export addnums, export subtractnums. We receive it as an object, but we can use destructuring to capture the original names of those. And then we can just call them by name. We don't have to use any kind of dot notation or anything. It's very handy to use destructuring in these circumstances. So let's do an example of this. I've got some files over here. I've got a main file that's looking to use calculate total, get random index, and get title case, but they have not yet been imported. And we have some test numbers here that we can use to test a couple of these. So if we come over to calc, we can see we've got calculate total exists in the calc file. So if we want to export this as default, we need to do it down at the bottom. So I'm going to say export default, calculate total. That's all I have to do. And then in this file, I'm going to export them individually because I have more than one, and just say export const and export const. And it will put them in an object for me, but we're not going to create the object ourselves at the bottom like we used to. This just does it behind the scenes. So now over in main, I need two different import statements because I'm coming from two different files. The first one, I can just say import calculate total and from calc. Now you'll notice because I already had it exported here, VS Code picked up on it, and I was able to just tab over and complete this, and it knew about it. If I do import and then say, get random index, And I haven't even finished doing the second one, and it automatically knew where to find it because I had already exported it. So if you do the export part first, VS Code will help you find what you're looking for and get this right. And then it just looks like this. I used destructuring to pull both of those out of the export object. And I can now use them by name, no dot notation required. Okay, and we can run this. Let's come and say node chapter 28 slash module examples slash main. And I have an error. Yes, okay. So this gets me every single time, and it's going to get you too. So I'm glad this happened. VS Code was being all kinds of helpful and suggesting this for us. And it said, hey, I know where that is. The problem is when you go to actually run this file, you actually need the .js in there. And VS Code did not provide that for you. I'm not sure why it doesn't, but it doesn't. So make sure you have the .js in there. And now when we go to run it, it'll be just fine. So we see the 333 was the total. The random number is 94. And then our last one, Pride and Prejudice, is now properly formatted as title case. Okay. Yes, see, and I had this on my slide and I forgot to mention it. So yes, make sure that .js is added to the file name, even if VS Code doesn't suggest it. There you go. So again, import from are the keywords there. And you can direct reference something that was the default export, and you destructure things that were exported with multiple things in an object. Now let's talk about JS extensions. So this idea of extending syntax, you can take JavaScript and extend it with extra syntax that isn't normally included as part of JavaScript. And one of the most popular ones out there is JSX because it's used with React. And it makes it very easy to actually combine HTML and JavaScript together and return that as the content that should be put on a page. So you have to use this JS X placeholder with just open curly braces to put your JavaScript inside, and then everything else can just be HTML. And this works for just general JavaScript expressions that can be evaluated. The example that I have here is, title.to uppercase, and I've just put that in my little placeholder here between my H1 tags. And that entire thing gets stored in a variable. And that's perfectly valid JSX because we're combining that HTML with the JavaScript in that way. It will not work for declarations or mechanisms like loops and if-else blocks. You can't just go and throw something like that between these placeholders and have it execute it. You only can do something that can just be directly evaluated. Okay, I am going to cover more about this in another class. I do have a file here that you can take a look at where I've got this example, but this is going to make more sense in the context of React. So we will talk about that in the next lecture. Now let's talk about supersets. What if you have a different language that is still compatible with your language? TypeScript is considered a superset of JavaScript. It has its own rules because it allows you to apply types to your variables, but it is still valid JavaScript as long as it's transpiled, and we'll talk about transpiling in a minute. So it lets you assign type declarations, and it doesn't just let you do it, it requires it. You have to provide types before that code is compiled and executed. So you're accustomed to not having to specify the type with JavaScript. It allows you to say what something is, and then it infers the type based on the value you provide. So you, in JavaScript, would say, let Captain Pike equal Captain Pike. And it says, oh, hey, that's a string. I guess this is a string. TypeScript says, no, I want you to tell me what it's going to be up front. So let Captain Pike, which is a string, take the value of Captain Pike. Let years until disaster, which is a number, take the value of 10, and so on. And the value of this is that it prevents errors when types are not matched up properly, especially when you're working with, feeding things into functions and processing them certain ways. So it can be a really helpful addition. With Angular, which you may hear Angular referred to AngularJS. People will mistakenly use that term to refer to Angular, like modern Angular. It has not been based on JavaScript since its very first version, Angular 1. Since Angular 2, it's used TypeScript. So it's just Angular now. It's also sometimes used with React, although when we use React with you in the next 3 chapters, we're going to stick to just JavaScript. But if you wanted to know how to do this, you can declare TypeScript variables using letterconst, and then just add a colon after the name of the variable before you have the assignment operator, that equal sign, and you just say what the type is. So score is a number, greeting is a string, is ready is a Boolean, just like that. If you have an array, all the elements must be the same type so that you can actually provide that type. So you would add a colon and then have whatever the type is of the elements plus brackets like this. And you can see that scores is an array of numbers, and letters is an array of strings. And this is how you indicate that when you're setting the type before you initialize it. So in order to run TypeScript with Node, you actually transpile it to JavaScript. So there's this command tsc, and then you provide the file name, the TypeScript file name, and it will create the JavaScript file of the same name, and then you can use Node to run the JavaScript file. And if you make changes after that, you have to recompile it with tsc filename.ts before you run it again each time. So let's go over here to the TypeScript example and practice this. I'm going to open up my thing here. So you see what we've done here. I've got some variables, a string, a number, a Boolean. I've got an array of strings, cooking and horseback riding. And I'm console logging everything. And then for this one, I'm logging each of them separately by doing a quick for each higher order method. So now I'll go and I'll just make sure that all of this executes the way I expect it to. So I'm going to go to TSC chapter 28 / TS example. And now notice I have a brand new file here called tsexample.js. Now it has been transpiled to JavaScript. I can run it. So I can say node chapter 28 / tsexample.js. And we get our printout. Captain Pike, 10, true, cooking, and horseback riding. Okay. That's the idea there. So there are lots of things that can be transpiled to JavaScript. Transpilation is that process of compiling one language to another. And so we just saw how TypeScript was transpiled to JavaScript before we could run it. Babel is a tool that's used with React that allows us to manage this, because things are not compatible with browsers with like the modern version of JavaScript with all of the browsers out there. There can be a lot of different versions and slight compatibility issues, and Babel helps bridge that gap. It also processes JSX. That was the combination of HTML and JavaScript that we just looked at. And it makes sure that the pages are going to render properly because it's in a form of taking the JavaScript and actually evaluating all of those expressions in the JSX and then providing HTML that the browsers know what to do with. So we'll look at this more as we get into React. You're going to see how this works. Okay, if you would like to do a little more practice with some of the modern JavaScript, I have a couple of exercises that are on Replit that you can get to from my website at codewithcarrie.com. And that's all I've got for you. So I will see you in the next lecture.